Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Yisrael Rothwex. I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of Sinai Schools. And to begin and kick off this year's webinar series, three-part series, and tonight is the first of those webinars. Tonight we'll be discussing really how to understand neuropsychological evaluations, and I could not think of anybody better qualified than Dr. Barry Krause, my colleague here at Sinai, school psychologist, to join me in this conversation. Dr. Krause has many years of experience as a private psychologist and also school psychologist, and works with families to help them through the process of making sure that they're getting what they need for their kids through evaluations. And I'm really looking forward to tonight's discussion. Just before we start, I want to let everybody know that there is a question and answer box that you can leave questions on, and hopefully towards the end of this evening's presentation, we'll have time to answer as many questions as possible. And of course, if we're not able to get to all of them, certainly would be honored, both Dr. Krause and I, to connect with you afterwards and help in any way that we can. So without further ado, Dr. Krause, welcome. Thanks for
thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being my partner in crime tonight. Okay, so let's get right to it. My intention tonight, so everybody should know, is that it's very hard in these conversations to be specific in a way where it's helpful for everybody's very detailed, specific, and unique set of circumstances. Everybody has different children with different profiles, different ages, and so what we try to do is the best that we can to explain a little bit about what a neuropsychological evaluation is, what you could expect from it, and also as a parent, what kinds of things you should be looking out for, and also how to interpret the best that you can as a layperson what the evaluations are trying to portray and to communicate. So, Dr. Krause, why don't we start off in just a very basic way? What is a neuropsychological evaluation, and when should parents consider investing in that process, both in terms of the time that involves and the money that it takes to get a neuropsychological evaluation? How do parents know when really this is a smart time to invest in that?
So a lot of our students usually, before they get to us, have struggled in some way. And I think that once they're in a Sinai program, or even if they're in general sort of struggling, and teachers or schools, administrators, or other outside providers have tried to put supports in place and they're not working well because the diagnostic picture isn't really clear about why the child is struggling or why they're behaving a certain way, that can be one reason to have your evaluated, just to clarify what might be going on. If there's been a change in their presentation, so if they looked one way and suddenly they look another way and you're not sure why, that's another reason that you might want to get your child evaluated. And if they've already been evaluated, but the evaluation was from a long time ago and your child has matured, it's a good idea to get a new one to update to see what they're currently looking like and what their current needs are.
Yeah. When we what kinds of information can a neuropsychological evaluation provide for parents that maybe they wouldn't otherwise be able to get, either from speaking to a mental health professional in their school that might know their child, or doing other types of testing? What is unique about this type of testing?
So a full neuropsychological evaluation is very comprehensive. It looks not just at how the child is doing in school or how they're performing, but why they might be doing these things. So you're looking at a full report. We'll look at how they're doing cognitively, like their IQ, their academic skills, their language processing. You're going to look at executive functioning, their learning and memory, sometimes their auditory processing or visual motor processing, and then their social emotional. And sometimes it gives you hard data about why there might be a discrepancy, let's say, between their intelligence and how they're performing in school, or why some of their behaviors look oppositional in one situation, but really there's something underlying that's causing them to behave in that way. So what I like about it is our kids are mysteries, right? Or they're complex, and we're really looking at them at one moment in time, but a diagnostic picture can tell you really what's going on underneath, what is sort of leading to what you're seeing in front of you. I mean, as a clinician or as a school psychologist, I have my best guesses, right? But hard data helps you figure out exactly what can be going on, what supports can be put into place once you know that information. It can help you access services that you might not have otherwise. And you can see also if you have concerns, there's been a change, it'll give you reasons why you're seeing that change. It uses both quantitative and qualitative measures to give you a real comprehensive picture of what's going on inside your child.
Sometimes when I am speaking with some of parents of students in our schools, and we're talking about the possibility of going to get a neuropsychological evaluation, oftentimes parents are hesitant for different reasons to do that, even if they recognize the value of getting an evaluation, as you just outlined. It is sometimes challenging for parents to get over that hump to actually make that decision to do. And one of those challenges is they fear that having having the truth kind of written black and white on a piece of paper is going to follow their child around for a long time. It will label them perhaps in a way that the parents wouldn't like. They just don't know what will be. I understand where that's coming from. As a parent, we want to protect our children. But what would you say to parents who know that they want to solve this mystery, as you described earlier, but are very hesitant because they know that what the power of this document may have, in the future?
I completely understand that. And putting your child through a neuropsychological evaluation is a very vulnerable process. You want to make sure that you're with somebody that you can trust and that you trust their judgment. But it's also important, like I mentioned before, to keep in mind this is a snapshot in time. This is what your child looks like now. These are the patterns of their functioning now. Some diagnoses, yes, they're hardwired. If your child is diagnosed with dyslexia, they will always have that language-based learning disability. But on the flip side, if it's something more like they have anxiety or depression, that's something that can change over time. And I think that, listen, I work in the world of special education. There are stigmas attached to things, unfortunately, but you have to think of the greater good of your child and making sure that they can access the services that they need, that they don't have continued experiences of either school failure, or a lot of kids, once they figure out why they think the way they think or learn the way they learn, it gives them a lot of confidence. A lot of them have very poor self-esteem based on their experiences, and saying like, oh, hey, actually, my brain is wired a little bit differently, and this is why I need this, or this is why I do that. It's a lot of relief for them, I found, at least, especially with the kids who can really understand it and they can embrace it, and they can it can become part of them, and it empowers them to know sort of why they're the type of learner that they are. I also want to let you know that these are confidential reports. So you, as the parent, when you hire the evaluator, that confidentiality, that privilege is yours. That written report belongs to you. So if you don't want to share it with somebody, you don't have to. Or if you only want to share part of it because it has some sensitive things, let's say in the background section, you can do that too.
Yeah, I mean, as a leader of a special ed school, we have prospective parents coming, and I ask for evaluations, and sometimes parents are hesitant in sharing that with us. And I explain to them that for two things. Firstly, as you mentioned earlier, it's a snapshot in time, and we don't necessarily feel like what somebody was then is what they are now. But even if that were the case, we recognize that actually the evaluations only tell so much of a story. And really what they're helpful to is not to explain this child from A to Z to me, but rather to provide, some trends, to understand where particular strengths are and where challenges, where the peaks and valleys are in the child's profile, and not necessarily to say, oh, well, your child has a 110 IQ or a 73 IQ. And I'm not getting stuck on the numbers, but it helps to tell kind of a story. And I don't think I'm unique in that way. I think that anybody who works in the mental health field or in the education field and is used to, in a regular way, reading these evaluations, recognizes that it's just that snapshot in time. And they, as professionals, even though they're making a decision about maybe where to, if to, accept a child to the program, as an example, they recognize that it's limited, but the power is really telling the picture of the big story. And so hopefully
I just want to mention, sorry, that also it sometimes helps reframe behaviors in a positive way. So for example, if your child is diagnosed with ADHD, suddenly the fact that they can't sit for a family dinner, or the fact that they're a little bit impulsive, you see it as a neurodivergence and ways that we can support it rather than something purely behavioral or purely oppositional. So sometimes it even helps with the overall family dynamic or the dynamic within the classroom as well.
I was just going to add that. It helps with the family, but also for the teachers to be able to now understand, oh, this is where this is coming from. If I just do this trick, or if I just structure the lesson in a different way, they'll be that much more, successful. And so I guess the point is, over the last few minutes, we're talking about, despite the fact that we understand that it is hard sometimes for parents to invest in this process because they're worried about the labeling or kind of following their child, we really have to focus on two things. Number one, the professionals who may potentially be reading this in the future aren't as stuck on those things as you might think. And number two, there are so many advantages to actually getting a good neuropsychological evaluation done. We'll talk soon about what that means, a good one. But that information can be so empowering to children and empowering to the adults in their lives to be able to help them. One of the other things that I hear from parents often is that they recognize that in life, you get what you pay for. And they are, hesitant to invest in a neuropsychological evaluation, because in order to get a good one, that oftentimes could be many, many thousands of dollars. And so that not that parents wouldn't do anything for their children, but once they're having maybe some other doubts, that's just yet another factor that presents itself. I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that you help parents kind of just process that and digest that?
So it is very expensive. It depends on where you're being tested. Like if you're in Manhattan, the rates are going to be higher, let's say, than they will be probably in New Jersey. So you can shop around geographically somewhat. There are other ways also. You can look for clinicians that offer sliding scale, which are rare, but they exist. I know that for cyanide SAR, we have a couple of clinicians who are good evaluators that we know are willing to do a few, let's say a year, under their normal fee in order to help the community. You can always request from your district, the Board of Ed. Usually it's not as comprehensive as a private evaluation, but if your interest is accessing services and your child is very obviously needs certain things, the district test can be a very good option. A couple of other things you might want to do, some insurances do cover. You just have to sometimes get a prescription from a pediatrician. You might need a pre-approval ahead of time. You can look into some community clinics will offer some neuropsych evaluations. Usually the waiting lists are long, so you have to keep that in mind. And doctoral programs are also actually a really good resource. You'd have to reach out to them at the beginning of each semester or over the summer before the year begins. And it is a slow process because you're having a student do the testing, but it's incredibly comprehensive. And generally, it's a high-level report because it's followed by their professor and a TA. So I know when I was in graduate school, part of my coursework was creating these reports, and they took a semester, but they were excellent work, and everything was followed very carefully. So that's another very good option in order to lower the cost. The other thing you can do is if you suspect there's some issue or you're tested first by the district and then you want an evaluator to look at something else, sometimes people will offer a limited evaluation where they might not do a full neuropsychological evaluation, but maybe they will do some of the things that were not covered in the district evaluation. So that's a good way to get some extra data. And other times, private clinicians sometimes offer payment plans. So even though the fee might be great, it's done in pieces, so it's more manageable.
Okay. One of the things that parents think about often when they finally make the decision to do that, to invest in a neuropsychological evaluation, is kind of where do I start? How do I find the right person? And what qualities should I be looking for? Not all neuropsychologists are created equal, like anybody else. What are some of the things that you should be looking out for to make sure that they're getting the most out of the evaluative process?
So in general, if you're within our Sinai community, excuse me, I would first ask your school psychologist for some recommendations. Or if you have friends in the community who their child went through the same thing, it's good to ask around. It's good to, the same way that you wouldn't necessarily just look up on your insurance and send your kid to any pediatrician, you talk to friends, you talk to other professionals, and you get a referral. So that's the first place I would start. Your evaluator just needs to be licensed within your state. You want to make sure that they are licensed. You also want to be very clear. Most psychologists, neuropsychologists will have a consultation with you on the phone before you invest in the process. See whether or not you feel comfortable with that person. Ask them what you can expect. What are you getting for your money? It's a huge investment of time and money. What are you getting, right? They should have a list of what you can expect, how long it will take, and what tests they use. I think that your evaluator should be open to questions before you start the process. They should be communicative, and you want to make sure that you feel comfortable because, as we said, it's a very vulnerable, time-consuming process. You want to make sure you trust that person. So I would say those are the sort of things that you should look into before you pursue it with a specific person.
Yeah, and I would add to that, the relationship, you were describing the vulnerability, or place yourself in this process is both for the parents and also for the child. And we want to look for somebody that we feel can develop a trusting, warm, comfortable relationship with both the adults and the children and the child who's involved in the process.
Right. I always talk to parents about how I want it to be a positive experience for the child. Even though it's a lot of time. For example, for myself, I offer a lot of breaks. We play games. I mean, if it's a teenager, they play on their phone when they have breaks, or we chat about their interests. For younger kids, I always offer prizes, a lot of positive reinforcement. You don't want to torture them, right? You want them to come. A lot of children I work with are like, oh, I want to go play games again with, Dr. Krause or Dr. Barry. You want it to be a positive experience for the child.
Yeah. All right, so let's kind of switch gears and get into a little bit about the test itself. What
Sure.
should parents expect that a neuropsychological evaluation look like? The different types of information that are shared, that are evaluated academically, socially, emotionally, and kind of for a lay person to open a neuropsychological evaluation, which could be 10, 20 pages long. How do they begin to make sense of the structure of the evaluation? What should they expect?
Sure. So unfortunately, there's no specific standard about how your report looks, what order people write things, how many scores they include in the body of it versus an appendix at the end. It's really a matter of how they've been trained or where they've been trained. But they will use a variety of tests in the various areas I'll mention in a minute. And different professionals choose different tests for various reasons, but as long as the tests are up to date and they have the correct additions, they're valid in terms of their psychometrics, they will give you a good report. So if, let's say, one child was given like the Wechsler for an IQ and somebody else was given the Stanford Binet, it doesn't mean that they don't give you both valid, important information. It was just the evaluator chose one over the other for whatever reason. So generally, when you look at a report, you'll have a referral question, you'll have a whole background section that sort of contributes to important information about the child leading up to this referral and this neuropsych evaluation. And then you'll get into the meat of the report. Reports will include a cognitive section, so that's the IQ, an achievement section, so that's the academics. So you're going to look at reading, writing, math. Depending on what the referral question is, you might add additional tests that look at reading or additional tests that look at math, whatever the issue might be. And you'll also have a language piece because language is important. Generally, you'll have executive functioning tests. So those might include things like continuous performance tests or questionnaires they give to parents and teachers. And there's always there's learning and memory that looks at your verbal memory and your visual memory. And there's a social emotional section as well. So the social emotional section might be more cursory, where it looks at kind of questionnaires and clinical impressions. But I think it's also important to have things like projective measures, so like sentence completion or the Rorschach inkblot test, figure drawing, things like that. In general, you want your report to really look at the child comprehensively. And so each section should have a variety of tests that kind of give you that data. And depending on what the referral question is, an evaluator will maybe add additional sections or additional tests. If something looks unclear, they'll add something in order to kind of discern what might be going on.
Yeah. One of the reasons why sometimes parents are looking for psychological evaluations is because they're looking to get accommodations for their children on testing, SATs, ACTs, PSATs, APs, all of those things. And so, if that is one of the motivations, again, assessing are there specific areas that they should be making sure, are covered in this test, or certain tests that are administered.
Sure. So if you're looking for additional time on standardized tests, whether it's for the College Boards or beyond, you need to make sure that you have a cognitive section that has an IQ score, and you also need an academic section that includes fluency tests, so how quickly you process. So that could be part of the Wechsler, the Wyatt, or the Woodcock-Johnson, the WJ has fluency tests. For high school students, they often include the Nelson-Denny reading tests. That's a big one when it comes to age-appropriate reading and reading comprehension and vocabulary. So you have a standard time measure and an extended time measure. That's like one of the gold standards to have in your report, especially when you're looking at things like the SATs, where you do have reading comprehension sections with multiple choice questions you need to complete.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. In each one of these sections, there are results that are offered by the evaluator, and those results usually are offered in two forms. There's the numbers, the hard data, and then there's hopefully the good explanation of that. And all of these tests are usually nationally normed. And one of the things that sometimes I don't struggle with, but when I have conversations with parents about around particular neuropsychological evaluations, is that the national norms are helpful, and that's kind of all you can get from testing. But sometimes in our community, the expectations and the norms of the academic achievement, or maybe even the psychological functioning, cognitive functioning, is very different than what you might find as a national norm. So how do parents kind of make sense of the data that's being given to them, but also knowing that, you know, in my child's particular situation, I might have to kind of distinguish a little bit and interpret a little bit differently.
Sure. So as you mentioned, they are based on national norms. There are two types of norms. There's grade-based norms and age-based norms. Age-based norms are considered more valid because you don't know what a child is taught in any particular school or what their curriculum is. So generally, you'll use age-based norms in order to compare them to other kids their same age. 68% of the population falls within average range when we're looking at these. I can pull up a bell curve if you'd like, do you think that would be helpful?
Sure.
Okay, sure. Let's pull one up 1 second. Okay. So everybody should be able to see my screen. So about 68% of the population, see this light gray here, is considered average. Okay, so average, let's say in the middle here is the 50th percentile, and it goes all the way down to the 25th and all the way up to the 75th percentile. The numbers you see here are about where they fall from the standard deviation from the mean, but you can see down here sort of the percentile ranks. So even though your child might be average, let's say, if they're reading at like a 27th percentile, even though it's technically average, they're not that proficient of a reader. And so what really matters in my opinion, is kind of when we're looking at the trends, when we're looking at sort of how their pattern of academic and cognitive function falls out. So what matters less is really where they fall on the bell curve, whether it's within average or low average or high average, or even all the way up to superior down to impaired. What really matters is how you're comparing things. So for example, even within IQ, they look at different areas of IQ. What's more important is not that, let's say, their working memory is, I don't know, the 35th percentile, which is considered average. If their verbal comprehension is, I don't know, 74th percentile, which is also considered average, there's a very big discrepancy there. So that tells you a lot more than just what the numbers say. And a good report will explain in the interpretation, well, why do we see these patterns and what do they mean for my child? I think you have to keep in mind, as you mentioned, because they're national norms, we often are in communities where education is highly valued, parents are very successful, very bright, and sometimes even though the child fits within national norms average range or on the lower end of average range, they might not be performing necessarily to your expectations or maybe to the expectations set by their siblings. So it's important to keep that in mind.
So what I'm hearing you say is that when we're reading a neuropsychological evaluation and it says that your child falls into the average range or above average range or at whatever range, the range isn't necessarily so helpful. It's kind of really drilling down into those numbers and being able to compare or contrast them to the other areas of functioning and kind of where that delta might be.
The numbers are important when you're trying to access certain services. So some numbers are very important. For example, in order to be able to diagnose an intellectual disability, you can't have an average IQ. Like there's certain things that those numbers are very important. And your evaluator will talk to you about that depending on what the referral question is. But if you're looking at the child holistically, what an evaluator is looking for are trends and patterns of their profile rather necessarily than specific numbers, unless the numbers show some kind of discrepancy.
So maybe we could just zoom out for a little bit. And, you know, there's a term that we all use kind of colloquially, which is IQ, right? And we know that the part of this evaluation is an IQ test. What does that mean when we say you have an IQ? That you're really smart or you're not so smart, and what does that tell you and inform about how we can help the child the best?
Sure. Over time, there are a lot of different theories about what intelligence is and the different types of intelligence and what that means for each individual. But basically what you need to know is that it's a composite score of different areas of cognitive functioning. And it looks at different areas of what we consider intelligence and the ability to learn, right? The ability to succeed in those various areas. So for example, if you look, one of the most common intelligence cognitive tests that's pretty much the standard is the Wechsler. So either the WISC is for children, the WAIS is for adults, the WIPSI, they're all part of the same family, is for kids below 6. And they look at different areas of cognitive functioning to sort of figure out, well, what kind of learner is your child? Where do they excel? Where maybe do they have certain weaknesses? And how will that impact how they learn? An IQ score, especially when you're younger and you take an IQ test, is not stable always. So it's important to keep that in mind, that just because, for example, let's say your child took an IQ test at age 5 and was considered gifted, it doesn't necessarily mean that if they take an IQ test at age 12 that they'll hit those same percentiles. They might, but intelligence cognitive functioning generally becomes more stable as you get older, and then starts to decline, obviously, as you reach, towards the later stage of your life. But it's not smart versus not smart. I think it's important to make sure of that. And the only reason that certain numbers of an IQ matter are to access services. So if you have if you're below 70 on your cognitive IQ score, you can access certain services as being intellectually disabled. Sometimes if you have, a 130 or above, or 129 or above, that's very superior, sometimes you can access services like gifted programs in the city, for example.
Yeah. So we were talking before about all the different sections that one can expect to see in a neuropsychological evaluation. And we also spoke earlier about how if you were to go to a district to get an evaluation, may not be as comprehensive. And in my experience, one of those areas that sometimes is left off of those less comprehensive evaluations are the parts that are, to me, the most important. They're the diagnostic impressions, they're the recommendations, and a rich recommendations that are super helpful. I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about, first of all, if you agree that those are some of the most important parts of evaluation, and what parents can expect to be able to get that. What kinds of recommendations should they be expecting from the evaluation? And maybe this is something they can even discuss in advance, with the evaluator, to make sure that that's something that they'll be getting.
Right. So I would agree. I think that private evaluators they do spend more time, I would say, on your child's report, and I think do a more thorough job sort of weaving together all the different aspects of the report. Not to say that a district report can't be a good report. I'm not downgrading that. I'm not saying you can't get a good report. I'm not saying that the information isn't valuable or valid. But I think that with a private full neuropsychological evaluation, you just have a fuller picture of the child. The diagnostic impressions, I think, are much clearer. You'll get a good summary that looks at the child holistically, and the recommendations should apply to different areas of the child's life. So recommendations regarding what should be changed in school, things like extra time, things like a note taker, maybe your child's a visual learner. And so that's something they need, visual cues. They can add things in the classroom, like maybe your child should get some sensory breaks. Maybe they need, maybe they need like an additional something in terms of auditory processing. They can't have any background noise. So those are things that you can change within the school environment. So you should always have a list of academic recommendations. And then there should oftentimes be, outside recommendations, whether or not it's a recommendation for an outside therapy or an outside therapist, whether or not it's recommendations for types of therapy your child should be looking into, or parenting work that can be done. I think what's really valuable also about working with a private evaluator is that they often have other connections within their field and people that they can recommend, or programs they can recommend to, in a way that you wouldn't necessarily get with a district. So, and they also generally also consult. Part, I think, of a good neuropsych eval is that your evaluator should be consulting with the school as well. I know when I complete them, or when, in my position as Sinai, I can sit and talk to the evaluator about the report, what recommendations make sense for us to implement in school, what things we should be looking for. I think that's an important part of the process, that consultation piece that comes along. You don't just give a parent a report and say, like, good luck to you, right? Instead, there should be a feedback session that goes over the results. You should have oftentimes the ability to have a second session once you get the report, so you have questions you want to ask them, or something you don't understand about the report or about the recommendations. And then they should also speak to the school, right? The report is not, it's supposed to be helpful. You're supposed to use it to access services and to support your child. And so having the professionals speak to one another, I think, is a very big part of that.
Yeah, so what you just described is, is ideal. But sometimes, for whatever reasons, parents might think that they're getting that deal, and then afterwards they realize they're just being given an evaluation and they're not being given that kind of attention by an evaluator. And I think it's important for parents to know that even if they're stuck in that kind of situation, you don't have to feel overwhelmed like it's on them. They may not want to share it with their friends, right? So how are they supposed to figure it out? There are people that they can go to. There are mental health professionals in their children's schools, or people who know, those kinds of professionals who know their children well, who might be able to sit down for a half hour with parents and be able to make sense of that evaluation. So even though ideally, we should be getting that kind of white glove service from the evaluator themselves. Even if that doesn't exist, there are ways to get that up and make sure that you, as parents, are getting that kind of making sure that you're able to understand the evaluation in the way that
within Sinai, I know we're happy to look at reports. I know that we look at reports before the school year to remind us of what things might be underlying for the kids, especially when we get new students. And so we're a good resource. I know at Sinai SAR, we're a good resource. You can always come and ask us questions about reports or about your evaluators. I think that's one of the beauties of our teams, because we have a lot of professionals who are capable of reading them and explaining them to parents if there are ever any questions.
Yeah. I guess lastly, we oftentimes our parents during different points in their children's development are faced with that decision. Should I be doing that testing again? I did it when my child was 5 and now he's 9, or now he's 6 and feel like he's a different child. So how should parents approach that, knowing about the significant investment of time and money like we discussed before? When is an appropriate time, both in terms of how much time in between each evaluation, but also are there different other independent criteria for thinking about what maybe this is a significant point in this child's development that it's time for a new evaluation, right?
Sure. So in order for reports to be considered valid or up to date by outside sources, it needs to be done within the past 3 years. So when you're within a community, like let's say you started with us at Sinai when your child was in 2nd grade and now they're in 6th grade, do you really need to get them retested? Maybe not. We'll continue to provide those services for them. Maybe they're up to 7th grade. Maybe you don't need to do it yet, right? Even if the test is not considered, up to date, we're already providing the services. Your child is doing well. There's no reason necessarily to have them redo it. However, if you're accessing services outside of your school or our community, it would need to be done every 3 years in order to keep it valid to access services. There might be other times that it's important also, especially if you want to access things like extended time for standardized tests. You need to build up a history in order to have those accommodations, like when you're dealing with the school, with the College Board or beyond. And so if you start it early, you need to keep it up in order to show that those things are still necessary.
Can you do it for the first time in 9th grade or 10th grade, or you have to show a history?
Yeah. So you can start it in 9th grade If you're doing it in 11th grade, the College Board is less likely to grant accommodations, even if the report shows that your child needs it. So it's something to keep in mind for the future, especially for our college-bound students. If you're noticing things at the end of elementary school and the beginning of high school, you want to start building your case now. Especially for like high stakes testing, they really crack down on accommodations. And so you want to show that not just that your child needs it now, but that there is a history. Now, listen, if there's an acute issue that arises that they suddenly need it, that's different. But if you're noticing it early on, you want to make sure you keep things valid. And also when you're switching from school to school, I mean, like developmentally, like if you're going from elementary school to high school, if you haven't had that report done in a long time, it's probably good because the demands of high school are very different than the demands of middle school or elementary school. If you're heading into college, those demands are very different, and you want to make sure that your child has access to whatever they need. They can choose not to use them, but you want that to be an option for them.
Amazing. So I thought maybe we could take a few minutes to answer some of questions. We got some questions in advance, and we have some questions that were submitted during tonight's presentation. We'll try to get to as many as possible. And like I said in the beginning, if for whatever reason we're not able to get all of them this evening, we're both here to be able to connect with you afterwards. So just I guess to start off, one question is, what do I do if I don't agree with the recommendations the evaluator made in the report?
That is a good question.
Yeah.
Ideally, during the feedback session, when the evaluator talks to you, it should be a light bulb moment of, oh, that really encapsulates them. That is the sign of a report. However, that doesn't always happen. It's important to be able to ask questions during the feedback process, or even afterwards when you're reading through the report. You want to understand why the evaluator came to their certain diagnoses, or how the recommendations will help support your child. Sometimes parents, like we discussed in the very beginning in terms of it being maybe a stigma, sometimes parents have a hard time coming to terms, especially when things are written in black and white in an evaluation, what that diagnosis might be saying about their child, what it might mean for the child's trajectory. Sometimes it's a process in order to kind of sort of accept what is really going on with your child, particularly if it doesn't jive with what you expected for them. I think that's a lot of our parents struggle with that feeling of grief or loss at the beginning of this process. Ultimately, I think that it's helpful, as we talked about in the very beginning of the presentation, the pros outweigh the cons of having a certain diagnosis or a certain label. But if you really feel like it's wrong, question your evaluator. Find out, well, why do they think that? Or is that really valid? You can always get a second opinion. And you can always bring it to us in school and say, does this make sense to you? And go from there.
Amazing. One of the questions we got tonight was, can you explain the difference between a neuropsychologist versus a developmental pediatrician?
Oh my, sure. I can do my best. So a developmental pediatrician does work with children and looks at whether or not there's the presence of some sort of developmental disability, whether or not there is something sort of atypical about your child's development, or what a cluster of symptoms might look like. They usually can come up based on your child's symptomology, can come up with a diagnosis. However, it doesn't look at every area of a child's functioning. A neuropsychological evaluation is more comprehensive, and sometimes, or oftentimes, a developmental pediatrician will refer one of their patients for a neuropsych eval to get a clearer picture about what might be going on.
Okay, amazing. A really interesting.
I should also say one goes to medical school and is a pediatrician and specializes in the developmental period, whereas a neuropsychologist goes to graduate school and has a doctorate and looks at how the brain functions.
Right. An interesting question, which I'm sure you get a lot when you do evaluations, is what if your child has trouble focusing and sitting still? Are you still going to get valid results from the evaluation?
That's a great question. I have a lot of experience with that.
I would imagine.
Sometimes instead of having like a long sitting, for example, you might break it down into a frequent short sessions. This is especially good for kids with pretty severe ADHD or for younger kids. So instead of having them sit for 2 hours and taking breaks, you might just have half an hour sessions, you know, a couple times a week for an extended period of time. There are ways to sort of help kids sit at least and perform for small periods of time. However, if a child is really hyperactive, really impulsive, it might be a better idea if you're looking for other areas, what other things might be going on with them other than the ADHD, it might be better to hold off on a full neuropsych evaluation until after they started treatment for ADHD. So whether it's medication or otherwise, if you're just looking for the ADHD and you think that's really all that's going on, the evaluator will write the report with a lot of conditions, you know, in terms of saying like they didn't perform, you know, these results should be interpreted with caution, et cetera, et cetera. But if you think something else might be going on, first address the ADHD and then bring the child back when they can actually perform and you can actually see what might be going, let's say, with their academic skills, their academic development.
Excellent. Maybe we have time for one or two more questions. Sure. One of the questions we got was, I did a district evaluation, and even though I don't think it's great, my son is getting services now. Is it really important to do a private evaluation?
I would say it depends on why you wanted your child evaluated in the first place and what you mean by not great. So did you want them evaluated just so they could access services? If that's the case and they're accessing them, then I don't think it's worth you spending your time or your money for a full evaluation. If it's not great because you feel like there's a lot of other things going on with your child that is not explained in the report, then I would say it's important to pursue something more comprehensive so you can really understand what might be going on.
Amazing. Okay. Well, I thank you so much for your participation tonight and for taking the time to help our parents and professionals out there make sure that we're doing the best by going through the evaluative process for our kids. I would love for everybody to, if you're able to provide feedback, you will be getting an email as a follow-up to this. And please, any feedback for us or suggestions of future webinars that you might be interested in, please let us know. You will be getting emails about our future webinars that are scheduled over the coming months, and I hope that you'll join us then. And lastly, this webinar was recorded, and if for some reason you came left early, or you'd like to share it with friends, it will be up on our website over the coming days, and we'll be sending an email out to you about that as well. So thank you all for joining us. Looking forward to seeing you virtually again, and thank you, Dr. Krause, for your time and your expertise this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, have a great night, everybody.